September 1945. The air over a coastal Japanese town is still heavy with smoke, though the guns have fallen silent. Roofs are gone. Windows are boarded with scraps of wood and cloth. The streets are quiet in a way they have not been for years. Near a damaged school building, children stand in loose clusters. They are thin. Their clothes hang loosely from shoulders grown too narrow by months of rationing. They do not speak loudly. They watch. Across the courtyard, American nurses move carefully through the debris. Their uniforms are unfamiliar, clean but worn, practical rather than ceremonial. They carry canvas bags instead of rifles. No orders are shouted. No whistles sound. When they speak, it is low, deliberate, almost hesitant, as if sound itself might break something fragile. A young boy follows at a distance. Then another. No one tells them to stop. No one tells them to come closer either. The nurses kneel to examine a child seated on a step, their movements slow, predictable. Hands wash. Bandages are unrolled. A cup is offered, held steady until small fingers accept it. For the first time in years, authority moves without threat. That quiet difference, almost invisible, marks the beginning of a transformation that had nothing to do with surrender documents or victory speeches, and everything to do with what came after the fighting stopped. By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation exhausted beyond precedent. Years of total war had hollowed out its cities, its infrastructure, and its civilian population. Strategic bombing had reduced entire urban districts to ash. Maritime blockades had severed supply lines. Food shortages were no longer episodic, they were systemic. Children bore the consequences most visibly. Even before Japan's formal surrender on August 15, 1945, pediatric malnutrition had become widespread. Rice rations were cut repeatedly throughout 1944 and early 1945. Protein sources all but vanished. In many regions, children survived on diluted gruels, sweet potato vines, or whatever could be scavenged from ruined fields. Diseases once controlled by public health systems, tuberculosis, dysentery, parasitic infections, returned with force. The collapse of Japan's medical infrastructure accelerated this crisis. Hospitals had been damaged or destroyed. Medical supplies were redirected toward military use until there was little left to redirect. Trained doctors were conscripted or killed. Nurses were overworked, under-resourced, and in many areas simply absent. By the time Allied forces arrived, civilian medicine in much of Japan functioned only in fragments. The Allied occupation was not conceived as a humanitarian mission. It was a political and strategic operation designed to demilitarize, demobilize, and restructure the Japanese state. Yet from the earliest planning stages, Allied leadership recognized a dangerous reality. A collapsing civilian population could destabilize the occupation itself. American intelligence reports from mid-1945 warned of potential famine conditions if food distribution failed. Public health officers predicted outbreaks that could spread rapidly among both civilians and occupation troops. Children were identified as the most vulnerable population, and also the most likely vector through which disease could proliferate unchecked. As a result, medical intervention became inseparable from security policy. The U.S. Army Medical Corps and Navy medical units prepared for large-scale civilian health operations alongside their military responsibilities. American nurses, many already experienced from campaigns in the Pacific, Europe, and liberated territories, were reassigned from battlefield hospitals to occupation duties. Their role was not framed in emotional or symbolic terms. It was framed as necessity. Yet necessity does not operate in a vacuum. Japanese civilians had been conditioned by years of wartime messaging to expect brutality from the enemy. American forces were depicted as violent, undisciplined, and morally corrupt. Fear of occupation was widespread and deeply internalized. For children, these fears were absorbed without context, without nuance, only as atmosphere. When American nurses began appearing in schools, clinics, and makeshift aid stations, they entered not just devastated spaces, but a psychological landscape shaped by years of warning and expectation. Their presence alone challenged assumptions. Their behavior, measured, quiet, procedural, challenged them further. And as these encounters multiplied across towns and cities, the broader conditions that had shaped them came into sharper focus, revealing how deeply war had altered everyday life long before the first nurse ever arrived. By the time American occupation forces fully established control across Japan in late August and September 1945, civilian life was suspended between collapse and reassembly. The war had ended on paper, but on the ground, systems that sustained daily survival no longer functioned in predictable ways. Transportation networks were fractured. Fuel was scarce. Administrative authority existed unevenly, sometimes reduced to handwritten notices posted on damaged buildings. For children, this uncertainty was total. Schools had been closed for months, in some cases years. Many had been converted into evacuation shelters, military depots, or rubble fields. Teachers were missing, displaced, or dead. Routine, the structure that defines childhood, had vanished. Days were measured not by lessons or play, but by hunger and air raid memory. The Japanese government, under Allied supervision, attempted to restore basic services, but its capacity was limited. Food distribution depended heavily on Allied imports, particularly from the United States. In the autumn of 1945, American shipments of wheat, powdered milk, and other staples began arriving in significant quantities. These supplies were not acts of charity in the sentimental sense. They were components of stabilization policy designed to prevent famine, unrest, and disease. Children became central to this effort almost immediately. Occupation health directives identified pediatric care as a priority category. Clinics were instructed to admit children regardless of family status or background. Malnourished minors were to be monitored closely to prevent refeeding shock, a condition already familiar to Allied medical personnel from liberated camps in Europe and Asia. Vaccination campaigns were reintroduced where possible. Basic hygiene, washing, delousing, clean clothing was emphasized as both medical treatment and disease prevention. American nurses were often the visible face of these policies. They worked in facilities that ranged from intact hospitals to improvised clinics set up in schools, temples, and municipal buildings with broken windows and no heat. Equipment was limited. Supplies were rationed. Yet procedures were consistent. Charts were kept. Measurements were taken. Children were weighed and reweighed not to judge progress symbolically, but to track survival. What distinguished these interactions was not generosity, but tone. Occupation guidelines stressed professionalism and restraint. Nurses were instructed to avoid displays of superiority or force. This was partly ethical, partly practical. Any perception of cruelty could fuel resistance or undermine cooperation. Calm behavior reduced fear. Predictability reduced panic. For children accustomed to shouted orders, drills, and wartime discipline, the absence of raised voices was striking. Language barriers complicated care. Many nurses spoke no Japanese. Interpreters were scarce. As a result, communication relied heavily on gesture, repetition, and routine. A cup extended. A blanket placed. A hand guiding, not pulling. These small actions accumulated meaning far beyond their immediate function. Parents observed from a distance, often silently. Years of propaganda had taught them to expect punishment. Instead, they saw their children treated first. This inversion unsettled assumptions that had governed wartime life. Authority, once associated with danger, now arrived quietly and left predictably. For children, the effect was even more direct. Fear did not disappear, but it lost its edge. Nurses returned each day. Care followed a schedule. Hunger was addressed methodically. In a world that had become arbitrary and violent, repetition itself became reassurance. These conditions did not resolve the trauma of war. They did not erase loss, but they created a space, narrow at first, where survival was no longer conditional on obedience or sacrifice. And within that space, a different set of relationships began to form, shaping how care, power, and memory would intersect as the occupation continued. Angle 1, the child's perspective. For Japanese children in 1945, the war had not been a sequence of battles or political declarations. It had been lived at ground level through hunger, displacement, and the constant anticipation of danger. Childhood unfolded under sirens, ration queues, and whispered instructions about how to behave if soldiers appeared. Authority had always been loud. It had demanded obedience. It had punished hesitation. When American medical personnel entered their world, the contrast was immediate and disorienting. Children were not shouted at. They were not lined up for inspection. Instead, they were guided. A hand on the shoulder, a gesture toward a stool, a nurse kneeling to eye level rather than standing over them. For children accustomed to rigid hierarchies, this physical lowering of authority carried meaning before words ever could. Fear remained, but it no longer dictated every movement. Many children hesitated at clinic doors, watching from outside before entering. Others followed friends who had already received food or treatment. Hunger overcame suspicion slowly. A cup of broth accepted. A bandage tolerated. The realization did not arrive all at once, but in fragments, that these uniforms did not punish, that raised voices were absent, that routine existed again. Observers noted how children watched nurses closely, studying expressions, waiting for anger that never came. Some mirrored gestures unconsciously. Others relaxed enough to sit or lie down without instruction. These behaviors were not signs of trust yet, but of recalibration. The rules had changed and children were learning the new ones through observation. The absence of shouting mattered profoundly. In wartime Japan, discipline had been vocal and absolute. Silence from authority was unfamiliar. Calmness felt unreal, yet repetition made it credible. Nurses returned each morning. Care followed a pattern. Predictability replaced threat. For children whose lives had been governed by alarms and commands, this quiet consistency became the first indication that the war's grip was loosening, not through declarations, but through daily experience. That shift in perception did not remain isolated. It rippled outward, shaping how other participants in the occupation understood their roles and responsibilities. Angle 2. The nurses' discipline. American nurses arriving in Japan in late 1945 carried training shaped by years of global conflict. Many had served in field hospitals across the Pacific or in Europe. They were accustomed to chaos, mass casualties, and the urgency of battlefield medicine. Yet civilian care in occupied Japan presented a different discipline, one defined not by speed alone but by restraint. Army medical manuals emphasized professionalism, emotional control, and consistency. Nurses were instructed to remain calm, avoid displays of authority, and minimize verbal commands whenever possible. These guidelines were practical. Language barriers were significant, but they were also deliberate. Occupation authorities understood that tone and behavior carried weight beyond medicine. Nurses became acutely aware of how closely they were observed. Every movement, how food was handed over, how a child was touched, how instructions were given, was interpreted. Many nurses adopted a quiet routine, relying on gestures and repetition rather than raised voices. This was not softness. It was discipline of a different kind. Control expressed through steadiness rather than command. The work was demanding. Clinics operated long hours with limited supplies. Malnutrition complicated even minor illnesses. Children were fragile, slow to respond, and often emotionally withdrawn. Yet nurses maintained the same procedures day after day. Washington: feed, treat, record, repeat. This consistency was essential. Reports from Army medical units noted that children responded better when routines were predictable. Calm behavior reduced panic. Silence prevented escalation. Over time, resistance softened. Children began to approach nurses voluntarily. Some waited outside clinics before opening hours. Others followed nurses between wards, observing quietly. The nurses themselves rarely framed this work in emotional terms. Letters and post-war interviews describe exhaustion more often than reflection. But embedded in their accounts is an awareness that restraint, never raising their voices, was as important as medicine. It distinguished care from coercion. That distinction carried consequences beyond the clinic walls. As children adjusted, adults watched. Parents and local officials observed interactions that contradicted years of wartime instruction. Authority, once inseparable from fear, was being redefined through repetition rather than force. This recalibration did not erase tension, but it introduced a new dynamic into the occupation, one that would increasingly shape policy decisions and moral judgments in the months that followed. The moment routine became revelation. By early 1946, the American occupation of Japan had entered a new phase. Combat had long ended, but its aftershocks continued to surface in quieter, more complex ways. Cities were rebuilding unevenly. Transportation remained limited. Food shortages persisted, particularly in urban centers where bombing had destroyed storage and distribution networks. For children, survival was no longer threatened by air raids, but by hunger, illness, and neglect accumulating in slow motion. It was within this environment that a subtle but decisive turning point emerged. In clinics established in school buildings, Buddhist temples, and requisitioned municipal halls, American nurses noticed a change in behavior that could not be measured in reports alone. Children no longer arrived only when carried by adults. Increasingly, they came on their own. Small groups formed outside clinic entrances before opening hours. They waited quietly, watching for familiar uniforms. This was new. For months, care had been delivered cautiously, almost experimentally, offered without demands, enforced authority, or raised voices. What began as medical necessity had evolved into pattern, and pattern, repeated daily, began to alter expectations. In several districts, nurses recorded that children followed them through corridors, mimicking gestures, helping distribute cups or straighten bedding. They did not speak much. Many still avoided direct eye contact, but they stayed close. Proximity replaced fear. This shift coincided with a broader crisis. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was among the harshest Japan had faced in decades. Fuel shortages left homes unheated. Food rations dropped below subsistence levels in some areas. Reports from the Civil Information and Education section warned of rising juvenile malnutrition and school absenteeism linked directly to hunger. Without intervention, childhood mortality risked climbing even in peacetime. Occupation authorities were forced to make choices. Medical resources were finite. Clinics were understaffed. Yet field reports increasingly recommended prioritizing pediatric care, not as moral gesture, but as stabilization strategy. Children, officers noted, were the most responsive to structured aid and the most vulnerable to long-term damage if neglected. Orders followed. In early 1946, medical directives expanded child-focused services, nutritional supplementation, routine examinations, hygiene programs, and vaccination drives. Nurses were instructed to maintain calm, non-confrontational interactions at all times. Loud commands were discouraged. Consistency was mandatory. This was the moment when practice became policy. What had once been individual discretion, never raising one's voice, was now institutionalized behavior. Authority in these spaces would be expressed through predictability, not volume. For Japanese children, the effect was immediate and profound. They began to anticipate care. They learned schedules. They recognized faces. The clinic ceased to be an unknown space and became part of daily geography. Fear did not vanish, but it no longer defined the encounter. And in that quiet adjustment, something irreversible occurred, setting the stage for consequences that neither side had fully anticipated. When authority changed shape, the turning point did not arrive with a single incident. There was no declaration, no confrontation, no symbolic gesture meant for headlines. Instead, it emerged through accumulation, small, repeated moments that slowly altered the emotional balance between occupier and occupied. By mid-1946, American nurses working in pediatric clinics across Japan observed a phenomenon that military planners had not predicted but could not ignore. Children were no longer simply receiving care. They were responding to it. In reports forwarded through medical channels, nurses noted behavioral changes that extended beyond physical recovery. Children who had arrived silent and withdrawn began to speak softly. Some asked questions. Others volunteered information, names, addresses, fragments of family history that had gone unspoken for months. A few attempted English words, not out of obligation, but curiosity. More striking was what did not happen. There were no incidents of resistance, no attempts to flee, no hostility, even when treatment was uncomfortable. Children complied not because they were ordered to, but because they trusted the routine. This was unprecedented. Japanese society before and during the war had been defined by hierarchical authority. Obedience was enforced through instruction, discipline, and social pressure. For children especially, correction was often immediate and vocal. In contrast, the clinics operated differently. Nurses spoke calmly. Instructions were demonstrated rather than shouted. Silence was not punished. For the children, authority had changed shape. This shift became most visible during moments of strain. As food shortages intensified during the summer of 1946, clinics were overwhelmed. Lines stretched outside buildings. Supplies ran low. Nurses were forced to deny additional rations, shorten examinations, and delay treatment. Under earlier wartime conditions, such scarcity had produced panic and disorder. Here it did not. Children waited. They sat against walls, shared space, followed instructions without protest. Some comforted younger children. Others watched nurses closely, mirroring their movements, folding cloth, stacking cups, tidying bedding. These behaviors were not taught. They emerged organically. Occupation psychologists attached to medical units documented the phenomenon carefully. Their assessments avoided emotional language, but the implication was clear. The relationship between authority and fear was being rewritten in real time. This recalibration extended beyond clinic walls. Parents observed the change with a mixture of relief and unease. Many had lived under years of messaging that framed the enemy as brutal and humiliating. Instead, they saw their children return calmer, fed, cleaner, and less fearful. The contradiction was difficult to reconcile. For some adults, this created quiet resentment. For others, reluctant gratitude. For many, confusion. But for children, the meaning was simpler. They had discovered a space where power did not announce itself through volume, where correction did not arrive as punishment, where adults returned each day and behaved the same way. This consistency, more than food or medicine, marked the true climax of the encounter. The war's emotional structure had collapsed, and in its place, something unfamiliar but stabilizing had taken hold. That transformation would not end the suffering of occupation, but it would shape how its consequences unfolded. Long after the clinics closed and the nurses moved on. Stability after silence. By late 1946, the most visible emergencies had eased, but the consequences of what had occurred inside clinics and aid stations continued to ripple outward. Japan was no longer at war, yet it was not at peace. Cities remained scarred. Industry functioned unevenly. Food shortages persisted into 1947 in several regions. The occupation authorities shifted focus from immediate relief to reconstruction, governance, and economic reform. But for children, the aftermath unfolded on a different timeline, measured not in policy changes but in regained routines. Medical reports from occupation zones recorded a steady decline in pediatric mortality. Malnutrition rates decreased slowly but consistently where organized care had been maintained. Vaccination campaigns resumed. School-based health checks were reintroduced under Allied supervision. These developments were technical on paper, but transformative in practice. For many children, the clinics had been their first experience of continuity in years. That continuity began to extend beyond medicine. In areas where nurses had worked consistently, local administrators, often newly appointed or reinstated, modeled similar procedures. Clinics kept schedules. Schools reopened with health inspections. Food distribution followed predictable patterns. The chaos of the immediate post-surrender period gradually narrowed. This was not a smooth process. Resources remained limited. Rural regions lagged behind cities. Orphans and displaced children continued to strain the system, but the expectation of care had been established. Children and parents alike began to anticipate presence rather than absence, staff rather than ruins, routine rather than improvisation. Occupation authorities took note. Internal memoranda from SCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, Medical divisions emphasized maintaining pediatric services even as budgets tightened. The reasoning was practical. Children were seen as indicators of broader civilian stability. When they improved, other measures tended to follow. Yet the deeper impact was psychological. Children who had lived under years of alarm sirens, orders, scarcity, began to associate authority with predictability rather than threat. This did not erase trauma. Nightmares, anxiety, and grief remained common, but the daily expectation of calm interaction altered how fear was processed. Observers from both Allied and Japanese institutions remarked on behavioral changes. Children spoke more freely. Teachers reported improved attention spans. Medical staff noted reduced resistance to treatment. These shifts were incremental, often fragile, but they were consistent. For parents, the aftermath was more complicated. Many adults struggled with the inversion they had witnessed. Foreign occupiers providing stability where the wartime state had failed. Gratitude existed alongside humiliation. Relief alongside resentment. These emotions did not resolve neatly. They coexisted. But children experienced the transition differently. They did not interpret occupation through ideology. They understood it through experience. Through who arrived each morning. Through whose voice remained calm. Through whose hands returned when promised. In that sense, the aftermath was already shaping memory, long before history could define meaning. Those memories would continue to form as occupation deepened and responsibility gradually shifted back into Japanese hands. And it was within that transfer between foreign care and domestic reconstruction that the final consequences of this moment became clear. From occupation to memory. As 1947 approached, the visible presence of American nurses in Japanese towns began to diminish, not abruptly, but deliberately. Occupation policy evolved. Emergency medical units were consolidated or withdrawn. Japanese health institutions, rebuilt under Allied oversight, resumed primary responsibility. Clinics once staffed by foreign personnel transitioned to mixed teams, then gradually to domestic control. Supplies stabilized. Training programs expanded. The system began to stand on its own. For administrators, this marked progress. For children, it marked an ending. Many did not understand why familiar faces stopped appearing. Nurses who had returned each morning without fail were reassigned or sent home. There were no announcements, no ceremonies. One day they were simply gone. Care continued, but the quiet certainty that had accompanied those early months shifted. Psychological observers noted brief regressions. Increased anxiety. Withdrawal. Questions children could not articulate. The routines remained, but the figures who had embodied them changed. Yet the foundation held. The practices introduced during occupation, regular examinations, calm communication, structured care, had been absorbed into the system. Japanese nurses and doctors continued them, often consciously. Some had trained alongside Americans. Others had observed closely. The methods endured because they worked. By late 1947, pediatric health indicators across much of occupied Japan showed measurable improvement compared to the final wartime years. Mortality rates declined. School attendance increased. Clinics reported fewer advanced cases of preventable disease. These outcomes were the result of policy, resources, and institutional rebuilding, but also of trust rebuilt quietly at the lowest level. The memory of that trust persisted longest among children. Post-war interviews conducted decades later reveal a consistent pattern. When asked about the war's end, many former children did not reference surrender broadcasts or political reforms. They spoke instead of moments that felt personal. Being given food without being asked to earn it. Being treated gently when they expected discipline. Being spoken to softly in a world that had only shouted. American nurses rarely appeared as heroes in these recollections. They were remembered as constant, present, calm. This distinction mattered. Heroism implies exception. What these children remembered was reliability. For the occupation authorities, the episode became a footnote, rarely emphasized in official histories. It did not fit neatly into narratives of strategy or diplomacy. Produced no declarations, no treaties, no monuments. Yet its effects were embedded in daily life. The transfer of care back to Japanese institutions did not erase what had occurred. It absorbed it, and as the post-war generation grew older, their earliest memories of peace were shaped less by ideology than by experience, by the first time authority arrived without violence and discipline without fear. This did not absolve the war. It did not simplify its moral weight, but it introduced complexity where absolutes had once dominated. In that complexity, something durable took root. The aftermath, then, was not merely recovery, it was redefinition. And with that redefinition complete, only one question remained. How should history understand a war that ended, for some, not in surrender, but in silence, routine, and care?